Well, good evening, everybody. I hope everybody's ready to delve back into First Timothy. It's been an awesome day, and I hope you have your Bibles opened up and ready as we attack this first part of Timothy. If you remember, last week we read the book, and I hope you've read the book throughout the week, hopefully multiple times. If you do that, I promise you, you are going to get so much out of this study, so much more than if you were just to watch these videos. But I hope these videos are a blessing to you. I hope the study's a blessing to you. There's a lot in this book, some good information in this book that can help us as Christians and help us as we look to what we can do for our local congregations particularly. Sometimes I think we ignore these books because we look at them and they're called collectively, when you think of 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, the pastoral epistles. And so we look at those as just letters to preachers, and so they don't deal with normal, your average member, and it couldn't be further from the truth. There's a lot of principles here that can help us in our individual lives dealing with problems within the congregation. Because if you remember, the whole setting of this first letter is that Paul has left Timothy in Ephesus to deal and to help them spiritually and to help them grow and to help the congregation grow, but also to deal with some of the problems that are actually in that congregation. And so that's what we're talking about here. And Paul is encouraging Timothy to stay strong and giving him some advice. You got to remember, Timothy and Paul had a mentor relationship. Paul was his mentor, and of course, Paul is older at this point. Timothy is a young man, and he's giving him advice, biblical, inspired advice on how to deal with some of these problems. And so let's delve back into the text. We're in chapter 1. We looked at the greeting last week, the first 2 verses. And so this evening we're going to look at verses 3 through 11 of 1 Timothy chapter 1. And we're going to look as Paul is telling Timothy very, very bluntly, you need to deal with the false teaching that's going on within the congregation. And so let's begin reading. Verse 3 says, "As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus, that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine, nor give heed to fables and endless genealogies, which cause disputes rather than godly edification, which is in faith. Now the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith, from which some, having strayed, have turned aside to idle talk, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor the things which they affirm. But we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless and insubordinate, for the ungodly and for sinners, for the unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for fornicators, for sodomites, for kidnappers, for liars, for perjurers, and if there is any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which was committed to my trust." Okay, so we are getting right into the heart of the matter, right at the beginning of the letter. He greets Timothy, Paul does, and right away he jumps in. Okay, first problem, we need, one of the main purposes why you're in Ephesus, verse 3, is that you charge these individuals not to preach any other doctrine, not to teach any other doctrine. And so the first thing we see that Paul is dealing with and encouraging Timothy to deal with is this idea of protecting the truth. And that is something that's, again, very, very relevant to us today. We need to protect the truth. We need to hold the scriptures as sacred, and I think most of us, if you're watching this video, that's probably your attitude. I hope it is. But the Bible is to be something sacred to us. It's important to us. It's our guide to get to heaven. It's God speaking to us. It's inspired. It's His Word. And that means we need to protect it. We need to protect it from individuals who would want to water it down, who would want to change the meaning of the text or to change it to fit societal norms. as society changes, culture changes, the Word of God never will change. In this case, you have these Jewish teachers who are trying to change the Word. And so Paul is telling Timothy, hey, you need to put them down. You need to make sure to urge them to teach what God has said and not this other stuff that they're trying to pull in. And so we protect the truth, but we're to protect the truth through teaching the truth. Isn't that something? Sometimes I'm afraid we want to protect the truth by teaching every minute detail of every false doctrine, whether it's infiltrating the church or not, or the local congregation is what I'm talking about. I had a situation years ago where I was trying out at a little congregation, and they brought up this subject, a problem, and it turned out they had this 3-hour men's meeting the night before, and this was on a Saturday night, and I was to speak Sunday, and Friday night they got together and talked for hours late into the night about this problem. And it was an issue about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, and that's something that's very, very relevant today. Huge problem within the church today. You have some weak-kneed elders who don't want to deal with it. You have some cowardly preachers who want to compromise the truth on it. The Bible is very clear. We make it a mess because we don't practice it in life. And next thing you know, our life is a total mess and it causes more pain. But that's not God's fault. It's not the teaching's fault. But we still want to change it. And so there was a situation. And so I asked him very bluntly, I said, well, is that actually going on here? Yeah, and as one who might come in and work with the congregation, you want to know that. Is that happening here? And they said, no. Oh, no. This is something we heard of. But this is something that happened way out west, and I haven't heard anything about that here. Wait a minute. You don't have to go in and have all of these debates over something that's going on across the country that's not affecting your local congregation. You know how to protect against stuff like that from coming in? You preach the truth. I don't have to preach every false doctrine known to mankind to protect the truth. You protect the truth by preaching the truth. And that's what Paul is telling Timothy here. You teach sound doctrine. And the word sound that Paul uses here is a word that means healthy. You teach healthy doctrine. In other words, you teach what God says. And when everyone understands and knows what God says, when someone says the opposite of that or something different, we can recognize it. We teach the truth. And by teaching the truth, we protect the truth. So let's delve into this and see what's going on and how we're to do that and what it's to look like. First thing, Timothy had to address the ones who weren't preaching the truth. He had to address these false teachers. Paul says you need to charge some that they teach no other doctrine. You know what that reminds me of? Galatians chapter 1. Did your mind go back to that? Mine did. Don't teach any other doctrine. Galatians 1, don't you remember? He says, Paul is talking to a group of people who just loved everything that was new and exciting. And they had, very shortly after Paul left what he had taught and went to these new philosophies and new ideas. And Paul says, I marvel that you're so soon removed from the gospel. And he tells them, and he even says it twice, even if an angel comes down and teaches another gospel than what we have spoken, let him be accursed. We do not have a right to stray from God's word. And so the first thing he says is you charge them. And that word charge is actually a military term, and it's to give them a command from a general to a private. You give them the command not to teach any other doctrine. And so this is very, very firm. So the first thing Timothy was to do was to make sure they're not teaching anything but the doctrine of Christ. Anything else is off ties. But then he goes on and he says, nor give heed to fables and endless genealogies. Now, this ties in, and what we're going to find in verse 7, that these false teachers, he says, they were desiring to be teachers of the law, and that's a reference to the law of Moses. So we're dealing with Jewish teachers who have infiltrated the church at Ephesus, and they're trying to twist the gospel to include the law of Moses or certain portions of the law of Moses. And if you put this together with the other epistles that Paul has written, we find out that the biggest thing was that of circumcision. The Judaizing teachers were pushing circumcision. And so Paul has to deal with that in multiple different places, in multiple different letters. But so more than likely, these are Judaizing teachers. They're pushing the law of Moses, portions of the law of Moses, onto these Gentile Christians, and they're causing divisions. They're causing Christians to fall away. And when Paul says, don't give heed to fables and endless genealogies, this was something that was very, very common with Jewish teaching. Jewish teaching wasn't just, let's look at what God has to say. It was a debate about what God had to say. Well, what does this law mean? And how is this to affect life? What does this law mean, and how does this to affect life? And so that's what this idea of these endless fables refers to. It refers to the way the Jewish teachers would teach. And so he's telling Timothy, hey, you tell the ones, you don't teach anything else other than what God says. You don't get into this whole debating type of thing. Have you ever sat in a Bible class? We think, well, we don't have Jewish or Judaizing teachers today, and we don't. We don't have anyone really pushing the law of Moses, and especially mainstream congregations. And so we think, well, what does this mean then? How does this affect us today? Have you ever sat in a Bible class? And I have. And there's no teaching going on. In fact, they don't even call them Bible class teachers. They are, what's the word they use? They're not administrators, but they almost sit up in class and they lead the discussion. They're facilitators. That's the word they use. They just lead the discussion. They're Bible facilitators. And so they'll get up, and you can tell some of them. I've sat in a class down in Florida one time where you could tell it was just, they just opened up the newspaper that morning, whatever the headline is. Well, this is our Bible class. They put no thought into it, no effort into it. Well, what did you think about this that happened this week? And they're facilitating a discussion. And so you have all manner of individuals sitting in this class, maybe new Christians who know nothing, maybe older Christians who know nothing, maybe some who do know something about the Bible and are wanting more biblical approach to the teaching. And instead of going through and teaching the Bible, you're teaching current events and what everybody likes to think about it, that's useless. You're wasting my time, you're wasting the class's time, you're wasting God's time in doing that. There's no place for that. Bible classes are to teach the Bible. When we come together to study the Bible, we need to be studying the Bible and not current events. I know a preacher who was lauded. Oh man, I moved into an area one time, and one family in particular, they just love this man. So we go to a gospel meeting, and I'm sitting there and I'm listening to this man preach, and he's just talking about his family for 30 minutes. And he's funny. He's entertaining. It wasn't boring. He was personable, and yet he told story after story after story. I think he might have used one verse, and he probably did that accidentally. I was on this game show, and this happened the other day, and I just love y'all. And on the ride back, they were like, wasn't he great? And I'm just sitting there thinking, what in the world? What in the world? Saw the same man preach the same lesson at a big event just a couple of years back. Heard some of the people who put on the event kind of shocked at it. I guess he had been recommended to them, and they said, well, we're not having him back. And I don't blame them. We're to teach the Bible, not stand up there and tell stories, not to stand up in the pulpit and be funny. We're not comedians. We're preachers, and we need to act like it. Our Bible classes aren't meant to be for anything but the Bible. We need to grow in our knowledge of the Bible. And that is going to help protect the truth when we teach the truth. So Paul tells Timothy right offhand, you go and you tell them, you don't teach anything but what God has to say. And you get rid of these fables and these endless genealogies. And again, that's that debating type of mindset that the Jews would have. because that's the specific false teachers that he's dealing with here. And so that's the first thing. You don't teach any other doctrine, because there's a consequence for that, because verse 4 says it causes disputes. There's that debating, right? It causes disputes or arguments. And then, not only that, it should be causing the Christians to be built up in their faith. But instead, they're just sitting there arguing with each other over this stuff. Debating, basically, debating foolishness instead of learning what God has to say. So it's a useless thing. It's hurting the people. It's causing division among the people through these debating. Paul says you put an end to it. You need to protect the truth by teaching the truth. There's a second thing Paul says here. Now, the purpose, verse 5. The purpose. Okay, here's the motivation behind it. Here's what it's supposed to be. The purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart. Here's why I'm charging you, Timothy. This is why I want you to do this. Because when we teach the Bible, it needs to be done in love. We've read that up elsewhere, haven't we? Haven't we? That is agape. It is to be taught with the best interest of the student, in this case, at heart. I'm teaching you the truth. I'm teaching you and telling you what God has to say because I want you to be better than you are today. I want your faith to be greater than it is today. I want you to be stronger spiritually than you are today. We teach the truth because we care about the student. We want their best. We have their best interests at heart. We want the best for them. That's agape. The purpose is love, and that love has to come from a pure heart. That is our motivation. It has to be pure heart. That's where love originates. If my heart isn't pure, if my motivation isn't pure, then I'm not going to have your best interests in mind as I'm teaching the truth. And I don't know about you, I've sat under preachers and teachers who I questioned their motivation. Have you ever done that? I don't know. I mean, maybe that's a me thing. But I've listened to preachers who sound like they really just have very little respect for the average Christian, because they're standing up there and they're talking down to them. They're talking in disgust about them. And I have to say, wait a minute. Yeah, I don't know about you, but when I hear someone who's patronizing me from the pulpit, I go blank. I tune them out. We as teachers, Bible class teachers, we as preachers, we can't do that. When you're trying to teach someone one-on-one and evangelize, you can't do that. Don't be patronizing and disrespectful. I know of a man who has done great work in the mission field, but man, when he comes to town, oh, mercy. He has so much disdain, such a pessimistic view. And that's easy. Honestly, that's easy for the man who runs a gospel meeting, for the missionary who is in town once a year. It's easy for someone to stand up and tear a congregation down, chew them a new one. And that's kind of their attitude. I'm going to get in there and show them. That's not how we're to preach and teach. That's not our motivation. Our motivation is to have concern for the church. We're not just up there and take a big old mallet and beat people over the head with it and make them feel this big. That's not our job. Our job is to make them better, not beat them up. And so we need to understand that, and the purpose is love from a pure heart, but also he says from a good conscience. Now this is an expression that talks about the character of the individual. You know, this isn't talking about Pinocchio and Jiminy Cricket kind of conscience. This is talking about the character of the individual. I'm to have pure motives, a pure heart, and I'm to have the best interest of the congregation at heart, the audience. but I'm to also have a good character. And I'm to be beneficial in my efforts because of my good character. You cannot have someone who is a complete jerk in real life stand up there and preach the truth and have it be any benefit. It's got to come from a pure heart. It's got to come from a good conscience. In other words, how are they living their life? And then finally, it's got to come from sincere faith, not hypocritical. Now, we want to put that sincerity and hypocrisy in that category of how they're living their life. Paul already dealt with that when he said good conscience. What's sincere? What's non-hypocritical? Faith. It's the idea, and it connects to a good life in that they're practicing what they preach, yes. But it also has to deal with, do they really believe what they're saying? Which again, all connects together. And so Timothy, here's how you do it. First, you tell the ones who are teaching this mess to stop it. And then you preach the truth, and you do that because you care about your audience. You want their best, you have their best interests at heart. You have pure motives behind it. You're not standing up there beating them down to show them you're better than them or to show them that you're right and they're wrong. That's not having a pure heart. You do it with a good conscience. You make sure you live out what you're preaching. And then you do so with a sincere faith. Make sure not only you live out in your actions what you're preaching, but that you believe what you're preaching. And don't just preach it because that's what everybody expects to hear. That's how you preach the truth. But there's a third thing here as we wrap up. Timothy needs to address those responsible for the false teaching. And that's what he does in the rest of this paragraph, beginning in verse 6. Here is what they look like. And there's an urgency of this. There's an urgency of this. In verse 6, he says, from which some, having strayed, do you see the urgency there? Have turned aside to idle talk. Instead of teaching the truth, they're hearing these false teachers, and as a result, some of them who have heard these false teachers have strayed from the truth. That's urgent. Timothy, you need to get them back in the fold. You need to correct this, because this is a heaven or hell issue, because some are following this false doctrine right down the road to hell. You want to know why we get aggravated, or where to get aggravated and see false doctrine as such a danger? Because it's spiritual poison. It takes us from walking in the light with God to walking in the darkness with Satan. That's why it's important. I've heard Christians say, well, I know they're not Church of Christ. First of all, you're speaking of the church like it's a denomination. Stop it. You're showing your ignorance. I know he's not Church of Christ, but he's such a good guy. This is heaven or hell. This is heaven or hell. Well, I don't like talking about denomination. You know what? Facts don't care about your feelings. This is heaven or hell. We need to realize this. Paul is waking Timothy up. Look, some are being turned away from the light of God's word and going down a road of darkness because of this. You need to stop it. That's why false teaching is dangerous. That's why denominationalism is dangerous, because it's filled with false teaching that doesn't show God's way, but instead upholds man's way. And so you know what? That guy may be the nicest guy in the world. He may be Mr. Rogers personified. He may love everybody, but he's caught up in a man-made institution that's dragging him to hell. And it may be dragging some of your family members as well. Friends, neighbors, all caught up into it. We shouldn't say, well, it's good, at least they're doing that. No, it's not. It's not good, because it hasn't changed your spiritual state. This is a heaven or hell issue, and Paul is showing urgency here. Some have strayed because of this, because they've turned aside to idle talk. Notice how he talks about that falsity. It's idle talk. It's useless, vain. It's useless talk. It's not helping them one bit. Not helping them one bit. And then he says they're desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor the things which they affirm. So here's what they're doing. They're trying to teach the law. This is these false teachers, these Judaizing teachers. They're trying to connect Christianity to Judaism by forcing these laws that were abdicated at the cross onto these Christians today, including circumcision and these feasts and stuff. Paul says, no, they don't understand what the law was meant for. You know, Paul talks about in another letter how the law was a schoolmaster that brings us to Jesus. The law pointed to a Messiah that was to come. And now that Messiah has come, and he's nailed the old law to the cross. And as a result, we're no longer under that old law. And yet here they are. They don't understand that, and so they want to be part of the law. They love the law because that's what they've always done. We've never heard that today, have we? And so now they're bringing up the law and binding it on Christians when the law has no teeth anymore. It's been done away with. He says, we know the law is good if one uses it lawfully, verse 8. Use it for what it was meant for. When you look at all of the sermons in the book of Acts, you know what they're quoting from? They're quoting from the Old Testament. They're teaching the Old Testament. Well, how can they do that? Well, the New Testament was not yet written and not yet completed. And so they use the Old Testament scriptures and those prophecies to prove that Jesus was the Christ. That's how you use the old law. The old law pointed to Jesus. The old law is to point the world to Jesus and to prove that Jesus is the Messiah that was promised. And that's how they used it in the book of Acts. There's an inspired example of the correct way to use the law. Paul says these people don't understand that. They're using the law trying to bind these minute, ridiculous little details of the law onto Christians today. And that's not the way to do it. They're not using it lawfully. And notice how he makes a contrast to all of this in verses 10 and 11. Here is the gospel. He calls it in verse 10 sound doctrine. Again, that word sound means healthy. It's a healthy doctrine. It's a doctrine that improves you spiritually. It deepens your faith because it's healthy. Well, what are they teaching? Well, they're teaching the opposite. They're teaching things that aren't going to improve your faith. They're going to weaken you spiritually. They're going to draw you away from God instead of the sound doctrine which will help you get closer to God. You see the contrast there? Healthy versus unhealthy doctrine. When you talk about sound doctrine and you hear preachers throw that out, well, that's not sound. They're talking about it's healthy. It's healthy doctrine. It's good for you. You know, sometimes as parents, we try to get our children to eat their vegetables. Why? Because it's good for you. Well, here's what God has to say. Why are you telling me that? It's good for you. You need to know it. Sound doctrine versus unsound or false doctrine. Healthy versus unhealthy. And then he says, according to verse 11, the glorious gospel. Do you see how he's holding that up? The gospel is something that's to be glorious. Again, a contrast is being made here, isn't it? Here's the false gospel that they're teaching, and it's not glorious. It's just the opposite. It doesn't lead to light, it leads to darkness. People are following it. It's dangerous. It's unhealthy. Here's a healthy doctrine, and it is glorious. It's something that's to be held up for all men to see. It's a light that draws us to God. And Paul says, Timothy, that's why you need to stop the false and hold up the true. You see, we protect the truth. And if you notice, there's a lot of strong language within here. But we protect the truth by preaching the truth. That's what we do as Christians. We protect the truth by holding on to the truth. We protect ourselves from the lies of the world and the lies of denominationalism by holding on to what God has to say. That's what's so important about that reformation or restoration rather call, to speak where the Bible speaks and be silent where the Bible's silent. We need to teach the Bible. We need to be students of the Bible. And we need to push the worldly things away. And make sure, let's get the the endless debates about current events out of our Bible classes. Let's get the funny little personal stories out of the pulpit. Let's put our emphasis, let's put our exclamation mark of life onto healthy doctrine. Because as Paul says in verse 11, it's a healthy, sound doctrine that comes from God that is absolutely glorious. I hope you enjoyed tonight. I hope you enjoyed going through this book. Again, there's a lot of strong things in this book. And there are a lot of things that may make us feel a little uncomfortable, but they're there, and they're there for a reason. And they're there to help us, and to help us have a better understanding of the importance of what God has to say and how beautiful His Word really, truly is. Hopefully, you're making your plans to be with us Wednesday night at 7. We're going to be live streaming. We found a YouTube workaround, so we're currently streaming live on Facebook and live on YouTube Wednesday night, and Lord willing, we were successful last Wednesday. Hopefully we'll be successful again. I'm sure we will. There may be some bugs here or there, but just bear with us. We're going to get them all ironed out. So be with us Wednesday night at 7. We're studying the book of Daniel, and had a great time last Wednesday night. It's fun to study for that class, and it's fun to present it, and we had a good discussion going on. And so I hope you'll join us there, or at least tune in if you can't be with us live. Next Sunday, 10 a.m., we're planning to worship together, again, live here at the building, but we'll also be live streaming. And then Sunday at 5, we'll premiere a new lesson in 1 Timothy, not the second yet, in 1 Timothy, and we'll go back and look. And this week we talked about protecting the truth by preaching the truth. And teaching the truth, but next week we're talking about protecting the truth by looking at the gospel itself as the glorious gospel, and what our attitude is to the gospel. You know, sometimes we prefer the false doctrine, or some individuals will prefer the false doctrine because of the way their life is, because they understand that the truth is going to require change of them, and they don't want to. And so let's see how all that fits in together as well. And so that's going to be next week, 5 o'clock Sunday. Hope you have plans to join us then. I hope everyone has a wonderful week, and I hope to see you back Wednesday night.